Oh, Mr. K here again. We are talking about engine overhaul, and we're going to jump into part one today, which is just disassembly, just taking the engine apart. Try not to get too complicated here because this is going to be a pretty new, pretty fresh thing for a lot of people. So we're just talking about taking it apart, but there are some tricks to disassembling it. You can't just rip it apart. Okay, you can hurt some stuff. So we're going to go through that. All right. So we're going to talk about do's and don'ts of disassembly and the order of disassembly and some techniques. All right. So there's a pretty good video here. It's kind of long. It's about 18 minutes, but I would strongly recommend that you pause my video now and watch this one. All right, you should just watch that video. Pretty good video. Doesn't show everything, but pretty good video. Kind of gets you the idea. All right. So first thing I'm going to tell you to do before you take anything off is take a bunch of pictures. Take pictures on your phone, borrow the classroom camera, take notes, draw diagrams, whatever you need to do. But there's always going to be something you have a question on later, especially if you're actually pulling this engine out of a car, taking it apart, and then you're going to put it back in the car later when you're done. There's always going to be something that you don't know where it went, don't know how it came out, don't know how it goes back. So take lots of pictures. You're going to need them. Okay, if I could narrow this presentation down into just two rules, or just take all 22 slides or 21 slides, delete all of them and just make one slide, I would narrow it down to this. Don't leave tooling marks on any engine parts, okay? Just like what you see from the pliers there. And don't use a magnet. If you follow those two rules, you're going to do better than most people do when they take apart an engine. So just think about those two things. All right. By the way, let's go back to that for a second. Why don't we want to leave tooling marks? Because tooling marks create little stress points in the metal. Well, there's a couple of reasons. They create little stress points in the metal. And then if that piece of metal or that part heats up and cools and heats up and cools, it expands and contracts thousands of times after you reinstall it in the motor, eventually those little tooling marks turn into cracks, and eventually they crack through, and then that part breaks. The magnet, the reason why you wouldn't want to use a magnet is that metal parts absorb magnetism. So if you use a magnet to pick a bolt up out of an engine, that bolt will then be, in theory, be magnetized forever until it gets demagnetized, which we don't have the capability of doing, and most people don't. But anyway, that bolt is magnetized forever. So you reinstall that bolt in the engine later on, and what happens is that bolt then attracts little bits of ground up metal, hangs onto them. That bolt's attached to a bearing or camshaft or something like that. You're attracting little bits of metal and contamination to that moving part, which you don't want to do. You want those bits of metal to get caught in the oil filter, not in a camshaft or a crank main bearing or a rod bearing or something like that. So we don't want to use magnets on engine parts. Okay, disassembly order. You're going to start from the outside and work your way in. So first thing I would do is get all that wire out of there. Get the wiring harness out of there. Get the sensors out of there. Those extra things, hoses. Now wouldn't be a bad time to take hoses off. Remember, pictures, because you're never going to figure out how these were routed if you don't have photos. Next, I remove the FIAD, and that's an industry term, and it stands for front end accessory drive. So that includes alternator, water pump, belt tensioner, crank damper, air conditioning compressor, whatever is up here that has a belt attached to it, belt pulley attached. All right. Remove air and fuel system. This could include turbocharger, throttle body, intake manifold, fuel rails, that type of stuff. Carburetor. All right, then it's down to the cylinder heads. Here's where it starts to get complicated. Here's where you actually need to know what you're doing, or you can mess stuff up. Okay, so remove cylinder heads. There are indeed special instructions. And you might ask, what are the special instructions? Well, we're going to watch a video on it in a second. The short answer is you can't just take the bolts out. You have to take them out in the right order, or else you can warp or crack a cylinder head or camshaft. Okay. Which, again, we'll watch a video about that in a minute here. Okay, once you remove the cylinder heads, I would remove the push rods and the lifters. There, if you don't know, those are the push rods, those long rods. The lifters are down in those little bores there, those little circular things. All right, how do you remove the lifters? That's a discussion you want to have. There's different ways. I'll tell you right now, the way I was taught in school was to use a piece of brass safety wire and bend it into a hook, grab the lifter and pull it out. That doesn't always work though. Why not a magnet? Remember, if you use a magnet, you're going to magnetize lifters and those are going to attract metal. Don't want to use a magnet. All right. This is the $28 Amazon tool, JEGS tool, Summit Racing tool that's meant for removing stuck lifters. I've actually never used one. I probably should order one, but I typically don't get a lifter that's stuck too badly. Usually I can get them out with a piece of hooked brass or copper wire. But anyway, there is a tool that's meant for it, and it looks like that. And on the right, you'll see a lifter that has been extracted from its bore there. So that's what a lifter looks like, or a typical lifter. There's different kinds. That's just one style. Usually you can just pull them out with your fingers, by the way. What you don't want to do is this. Okay. And I don't know why, but you can find lots of YouTube videos. You can find pictures, instructional instructions and manuals and things like that of how to remove lifters, and they're ripping them out with pliers. And remember, what does that do? It puts tiny little teeth marks in the lifters or in whatever it is you're grabbing if you use pliers, and puts little teeth marks in them. And then those little teeth marks eventually, as the metal expands and contracts over thousands or hundreds of times, that those teeth marks turn into cracks. We do not want that, obviously. It also increases wear because you're putting a sharp edge on a surface that has to rub another piece of metal. So I'm going to say no, do not do that. I want to make sure I didn't forget that. Okay, how about this? Same thing, they're just using channel locks instead of, or I'm sorry, not channel locks, vice grips or adjustable locking pliers instead of what we were just looking at. So yeah, once again, no, do not use pliers on lifters. Okay, that we'll get it out. Yeah, and if you're going to take the lifter out and throw it away, I guess that's okay, but it's just a bad habit to get into and it just kind of looks shoddy. Okay, so remember a few slides ago, I talked about removing cylinder heads and how that needs to be done at a specific, there are special instructions for it. Just as an example, here is a screenshot out of the Ford factory manual for a Ford 2.0 liter 4-cylinder engine. Super common, right? Used them in Focuses and other things like that. Super common engine. And if you're going to remove the cylinder head or even just remove a camshaft, you can't just take the cam out. You have to take it out in sequence. So this is from the factory Ford manual, telling you the sequence of how to loosen the camshafts and get them out, not how to tighten them. This is how to loosen. It's a loosening sequence. If you do not follow this, you can snap a camshaft, you can warp things, you can break things. So that you need to look at the manual before you take things apart sometimes, and this is a good example of that. All right, here's a great video. So the guy can be a little bit hard to understand at times, but it's a great video. Go ahead and watch that at this time. All right, you should have just watched that video on how to remove a cylinder head. He talked about going in a certain order to remove the cylinder head so it does not warp or crack. So now that we got the heads off, let's remove some pistons. Speaking of that, let's watch another great video. Go ahead and watch that one. Okay, should have just watched that video on how to remove pistons. Love it. He did everything by the book, I would say. Don't forget to put those fuel line protectors or fuel hose protectors on the threads, as he did when he was pushing the piston out, so it does not grind down on the cylinder walls and scratch them, or scratch the crank bearing journals. So very good video. Now that we got the pistons out, let's take a camshaft out. First, we're going to talk about removing a central cam, because we already removed the overhead cam in a couple slides ago when I talked about that Ford factory focus loosening sequence. So now let's remove a central cam, or some people call it an overhead valve cam engine. Notice as he was removing it, he's being pretty careful, and you probably saw that in the earlier video also. He's not dragging the cam, he's not just ripping it out, he's just kind of slowly walking out of there, clicking it, one single, bearing by bearing, lobe by lobe. If you just drag these out, you're going to just trash the bearings, and they will peel apart after you drive the thing 1,000 miles. So definitely have to take care with this, because the edges of those cam lobes are like razor sharp. You can cut your fingers on them. So if you can cut your fingers on them, you better believe they can tear up a lead faced bearing. All right, now the cam's out, let's get the crank out. You're going to remove the crankshaft main caps. You just wiggle them back and forth and they just pop loose. So nothing too crazy. Let's remove the crankshaft itself. After you remove the main caps, you're just going to lift the crank out. Don't drop it. And this time you've probably got your whole block disassembled, and then you can just make sure that's laid out nicely on a table. Make sure things are labeled. Make sure things are in bags. They don't do this in these pictures, but put your rocker arm and your lifter, if you want, or put just your rocker arm in a bag and label it cylinder 1. Put just that lifter in a bag, label it cylinder 1 exhaust, label another one cylinder 1 intake. Don't mix them up. It's okay. Use up the plastic bags. It's okay. Keep things separate, keep them labeled. Remember, you don't want to remix and match parts when you put it back together. And that's it. All righty. Have a good day.